Chapter 1. The Silence Breaks. There comes a time in the life of a nation when silence becomes betrayal. Captain Ibraim Powi understood that truth too well. Born in the parched valleys of northern Burkina Faso, he had grown up hearing his grandmother's stories of colonial soldiers and IMF consultants with matching arrogance. Her voice would tremble as she recalled the years when men in foreign uniforms made decisions over land they had never tilled, or when foreign experts dictated policies with charts but never tasted hunger. She spoke of foreign aid that never fed the hungry, of development plans that bulldozed villages and erased entire generations of history in the name of progress. But the story that stayed with him most came when he was only 8. His mother, a schoolteacher, returned from school with her eyes swollen from crying. That night, over a flickering kerosene lamp, she tried to explain what austerity reforms meant. The radio had buzzed with calm voices, polished accents, promising stability, but to her, it meant her salary slashed in half, fewer books for her students, and classrooms crumbling while consultants flew in on business class tickets. It was the first time young Powi saw hope drain from someone's face. Captain Powi did not come from a think tank or a business school. He didn't wear Italian suits or Harvard credentials. He came from red soil and black pain, from a land where children studied by candlelight because privatized grids flickered and died. He came from a nation drowning in gold, yet too poor to build a bridge over a seasonal river. His youth was marked by scarcity, by waiting for water to return to dry taps, for the next food delivery from foreign NGOs, for electricity to flicker back to life. And in that waiting, a fire smoldered. He joined the army not out of love for war, but because it was the only institution left that still promised purpose. There, among other sons of the soil, he learned the weight of silence. He watched as his comrades were sent to guard foreign-owned mines while their families drank from polluted wells. He carried the bodies of children who died not in conflict, but in hospitals without medicine. And each time he buried a life lost to decisions made far away, the silence grew heavier. On that historic day in Riyadh, in front of cameras broadcasting to billions, he stood at a podium not for applause but for confrontation. It wasn't vanity that brought him there, but the quiet rage of a people forgotten. He took a breath, not to steady himself, but to ignite a fire. "My name is Captain Ibraim Powi," he began, his voice low and steady. "I do not speak with the polish of career diplomats. I do not wear the cologne of multinational boardrooms. I speak from the battlefield, where my people bleed and the soil remembers. I am not here to ask for favor, nor to beg for compassion. I am here because silence has become betrayal. And I will be silent no more." A hush fell over the grand conference room. Suits stiffened in their seats. Interpreters leaned closer to their microphones. Somewhere in the back, a young journalist clicked record, sensing history. "I come from a nation where our wealth is exported and our people are forgotten, where gold leaves in airplanes and children die in delivery rooms without light, where we are told we are free, yet every decision is pre-written in a language not our own." He looked directly into the cameras now, speaking not to the elites before him, but to the millions watching across the globe. "We are not poor. We are plundered. We are not underdeveloped. We are overexploited. And we are done pretending that the price of global stability must be our silence." The room was stunned. But Powi wasn't finished. His speech was just beginning, and the storm he brought would echo far beyond the gilded walls of that Riyadh conference hall. This was the first spark the silence had broken, and the world would have no choice but to listen. Chapter 2. The Battlefield and the Banker. The audience in the investment hall expected formality. They expected suits, slogans, and another round of empty promises peppered with development buzzwords. What they got instead was thunder. Captain Ibraim Powi stood firm behind the microphone, his eyes scanning the hall with the same intensity he had used in reconnaissance missions. He wasn't here to be diplomatic. He was here to deliver an autopsy of a broken system. His words lashed out with precision, not from rage, but from years of observation, pain, and clarity. "We gather in buildings built by the profits of mines we do not own. We sip water bottled from rivers, diverted away from our villages. You speak of progress, but I have seen its corpse in the dust of my homeland." Powi raised a piece of paper, holding it in the air. "This," he said, "is a loan agreement. 50 pages of legalese written in Paris, signed in a rush by tired men under fluorescent lights, with terms that will outlive the children of the signatories. This is not a partnership. This is a trap disguised as paperwork. Some in the room stiffened. Others exchanged glances, unsure whether to laugh, walk out, or lean in. The cameras continued rolling. He paced slowly now, not reading from any script. "For too long," he said, "you have posed as benevolent doctors prescribing economic treatment to sick nations. But what we've suffered is that your medicine often kills the patient." He stopped. "You arrive with smiles," he continued, "but your loans are poisoned arrows wrapped in contracts. You speak of stabilization, but deliver strangulation. You promise reform, but what you mean is obedience to foreign models built in labs that never breathed African air." His words, carefully chosen, reverberated through the marble hall. For many, it was the first time they had heard such direct accusations delivered not from protesters outside the fence, but from someone at the podium. "Who taught us to privatize our water?" he asked, voice rising. "Who convinced us to sell our power plants to foreign companies? Who said our state hospitals were inefficient while building elite clinics for expatriates and diplomats?" He took a breath, letting silence fill the room. "Who?" he asked again. "And who profited when we obeyed?" Powi's cadence was not rehearsed. It was lived. Every phrase drew not just from reports, but from real memories. He had seen school children turned away because the school had become a fee-based charter. He had watched old women wait outside health clinics closed due to cost-cutting. He had seen soldiers paid late because budget priorities had shifted to service foreign debt. The language you speak of growth, reform, efficiency is built on abstractions. But I speak of blood. I speak of dignity. And I ask you, at what point does your theory become our funeral? He paused as murmurs rippled across the hall. A few diplomats looked down at their notes, pretending to be busy. One banker cleared his throat and stood to leave, but stopped when the cameras followed his movement. Powi continued, softer now, more deliberate. "I am not asking for charity," he said. "I am demanding a reckoning. I am asking you to see what you have made invisible, the lives between your spreadsheets." He walked back to the center of the stage. "You call us developing. You say our institutions are weak, our systems unstable. But I have seen your institutions. I have seen the balance sheets, the extractive contracts, the legal immunity clauses. I have seen a world order where the rules are rigged to protect the lender, never the borrower." He raised his hand as if lifting a veil. "This is not a conspiracy. This is a system. And we are done pretending it is anything else." With that, he stepped back. The hall was quiet. Not because they disagreed, but because someone had said what had long been whispered in corridors and scribbled in footnotes. Powi had not declared war. He had declared the truth. And in that moment, it struck deeper than any weapon ever could. Outside the hall, the sun beat down on Riyadh. But inside, something else had been set ablaze. A confrontation decades in the making had just begun. Chapter 3. The Numbers and the Names. Captain Ibraim Powi knew better than to rely on fire and fury alone. If the world was going to listen, it needed evidence. Hard numbers, unignorable names. He didn't just want to shake the conscience of those watching. He wanted to dismantle their illusions. He returned to the podium that afternoon, not with more metaphors, but with charts, ledgers, and case studies. The projection behind him lit up with the first slide. A map of Africa, glowing with mineral wealth, gold, cobalt, uranium, lithium, oil. 60% of the world's arable land. Over 30% of global mineral reserves. More sunlight than any continent. And yet, he paused, we import tomatoes. A chuckle rippled through the audience, but Powi's face didn't shift. We import wheat, milk, rice, even water. The chuckle died. He pointed to another slide. It showed a graph Africa's food imports climbing over the past 2 decades. Is this incompetence? Number. This is design. This is dependency, reinforced through policy. Structural adjustment programs that stripped away food subsidies, encouraged export crops over local staples, and destroyed food self-sufficiency. We were told to grow cotton and buy bread. He clicked again. Now came the contracts. He named a Canadian mining company operating in northern Burkina Faso. The firm had extracted over $200 million in gold over 7 years. But the village closest to the mine had no paved road, No clinic, no clean water. They gave us a borehole pump, he said flatly, and a corporate social responsibility report. The next slide showed an oil deal from the coast of Ghana. The terms: 85% of profits to the foreign partner for the first decade, with Ghana only receiving revenue after cost recovery. Tell me, Powi said, when we are only paid after your costs, and you decide the costs, how is that fair? He clicked again. The slide displayed repayment terms for a World Bank infrastructure loan in 2015, $500 million borrowed. But with interest, late fees, advisory fees, insurance premiums, and currency fluctuations, the final amount paid was $1.8 billion. That's not interest, that's a ransom, Powi said, voice steady. We are not borrowing to grow. We are renting back our own future. He told stories not to sentimentalize, but to humanize the data. A nurse in Wahiguya who had to reuse latex gloves because the hospital budget had been slashed under a fiscal reform mandate. A teacher in Mopti who worked 3 months without pay while the education ministry awaited a loan disbursement. A university graduate in Miami, fluent in 3 languages, reduced to selling SIM cards under a plastic umbrella. You ask us to measure success in GDP, he said, but GDP never attended a funeral. GDP never looked a child in the eye and said, "There is no medicine for you today." He looked out into the crowd, quieter now, not stunned but sobered. "What is consent?" he asked, "when the patient is bleeding and the only hand with medicine offers it at interest? What is choice when the gun isn't at your head but at the starving child behind you?" The room remained hushed. There were no murmurs this time. Every loan is sold to us with the language of partnership. But where is the partner who eats while the other starves? Who grows fat while the other wastes away? He turned toward the screen again. Another chart appeared. This time, it showed net capital flows. It revealed that far more money flows out of Africa annually than flows in. Aid, a drop. Debt repayments, profit repatriation, and illicit capital flight, a flood. So tell me, who is really aiding whom? For a moment, the room was silent enough to hear the soft hum of the cameras recording every word. This is not about blame, Powi concluded, but about balance. We cannot heal if we do not diagnose correctly. We cannot build new structures if we are shackled to the ruins of the old. He let the last slide stay up a moment longer. A photograph of a mother and child walking across a dusty plain. No caption, just humanity. And then he stepped away from the podium, not triumphant, but resolute. He had brought the receipts, and the world would now have to answer to more than slogans. Chapter 4. The fire spreads. It began as a ripple, a quiet murmur that danced across university campuses and rural market squares. But within 48 hours of Captain Powi's speech, that murmur had grown into a roar, raw, rhythmic, and relentless. What he had said was more than political, it was personal. He didn't just speak to policies, he spoke to pain, and millions recognized their lives in his words. On a campus radio station in Nairobi, the speech was replayed every hour. Students gathered in lecture halls not to study economics, but to deconstruct Powi's manifesto. Debate clubs turned into strategy sessions. What next? They asked. How do we take this fire from speech to system? In Lagos, rappers sampled his voice over pulsating beats, remixing his declaration. Your loans are poisoned arrows into an anthem that surged across clubs, taxis, and street protests. Artists painted murals of him, wrapped in traditional cloth, standing barefoot, holding a contract torn in half. The image spread faster than any press release. In Dakar, young women marched through the city holding handwritten signs. We are not debtors. We are daughters of dignity. And in Ouagadougou, Captain Powi's hometown, a crowd gathered not out of curiosity, but out of conviction. They weren't told to come. They came because something had shifted deep, tectonic, and irreversible. One mother told a journalist, "For years, I've listened to leaders speak in French, using words I didn't understand, about plans I never saw. But this one spoke my language, even when he used none of my words." The speech was shared through WhatsApp groups, burned onto CDs, uploaded to YouTube channels with millions of subscribers. Some dubbed it into local dialects. Others turned it into poetry. In one rural village in northern Ghana, elders gathered around a battery-powered radio, listening together in silence. At the end, one of them simply said, He speaks like our grandfathers used to, without fear. But as the message spread, so too did resistance. Western media outlets called the speech reckless populism. Economic analysts warned of a contagion of anti-investment sentiment. A major ratings agency released a bulletin lowering Burkina Faso's credit outlook, citing potential instability in fiscal policy. A French oil company suspended its project in the Sahel, blaming unpredictable leadership. Inside boardrooms in London, New York, and Paris, the phone lines buzzed. Emergency memos were dispatched. Monitor social sentiment in West Africa, one directive read. Identify influencers sympathetic to Powi's position. Discredit gently. But none of it worked, because this was not a PR problem. This was a soul awakening. In Zimbabwe, students translated the speech into Shona and hosted watch parties. In South Africa, a retired teacher began a podcast titled The Powi Papers, dissecting decades of IMF policies and their impact on African education. Hashtags like We Are Awake, Powi Rising, and Africa Reclaims flooded timelines. A viral TikTok showed a teenage girl from Uganda reciting a portion of the speech from memory in her school uniform, then removing her shoes in solidarity with Powi's barefoot stance. But perhaps the most powerful moment came 3 days later in Bamako. There, a young woman named Aminata, barely 20, stood outside the gates of the IMF's regional office. Alone at first, she held a cardboard sign with 4 words, "We are not slaves." By noon, 50 others had joined her. By dusk, they numbered in the thousands. They carried no flags. No political party claimed them. No banners were printed in advance. Yet the message was clear. This was a new kind of movement. And in the midst of it, Captain Powi remained silent. He did not tweet. He did not grant interviews. He did not ride the wave of adoration. Instead, he met quietly with elders, economists, youth leaders, and farmers. He asked questions, listened, wrote in notebooks. He knew the fire he'd lit could warm a continent, but it could also burn it down. This was not the time for ego. It was the time for discipline. For every celebration, he knew there would be sabotage. For every protest, a provocation. Foreign interests would not yield quietly. Some would try to infiltrate. Others would try to buy silence. But the people finally had begun to believe in their own voice. And once the people begin to speak, not even the tallest tower can silence them. From a simple speech came a storm. From numbers came names. And from one soldier came 1,000,000 sparks. Africa was no longer asking for permission. It was reclaiming its voice. Chapter 5. Sovereignty Reclaimed. 5 days after the Riyadh speech, as the embers of revolution began to smolder across cities and savannas, Captain Ibraim Powi stood once more before the people, this time not in front of a global audience, but on the worn stone steps of Burkina Faso's presidential compound. The sun was just rising, casting golden light across Ouagadougou, and thousands had gathered shoulder to shoulder beneath the national flag. He wore the same simple uniform. No medals, no podium, just a handheld microphone and the dust of the earth on his boots. "My people," he began, voice calm but resolute, "we are not here to celebrate a speech. We are here to begin a new era." A hush fell. Even the cicadas seemed to quiet. For too long, decisions about our destiny were made behind doors we couldn't open, in languages we didn't speak, under flags we didn't choose. That ends today. He raised a worn folder. This is a national audit of our debts line by line, dollar by dollar. Every loan, every clause, every hidden penalty. From this day forward, we will know what was signed in our name. And who signed it? Applause rippled, cautious at first, then thunderous. We will not reject development, but we will reject debt that devours us. We will not chase foreign approval. We will pursue dignity. Powi's government then unveiled what would become known as the 5 Pillars of Economic Sovereignty, a comprehensive national roadmap not just for survival, but for self-determination, audit, and transparency. A complete forensic review of Burkina Faso's external debts, mining licenses, and foreign aid agreements. All findings would be published publicly every quarter. No conditional loans. Any new financial agreements with foreign entities would require public parliamentary approval and must not include conditions that shrink public services or undermine national control. A sovereign wealth fund. Built from natural resource revenues, especially gold and rare earth minerals, the fund would be managed by a rotating citizen-led board. Profits would be reinvested into infrastructure, education, and healthcare. Regional economic integration. Rather than relying on colonial-era trade routes through European ports, the country would prioritize trade with neighbor-surviving trans-Sahelian markets and investing in cross-border infrastructure. Agrarian reform and food sovereignty. A nationwide initiative to reclaim idle land, empower smallholder farmers, and ensure no Burkinabe went hungry due to foreign price shocks or fertilizer dependency. These proposals were met with a mixture of admiration and anxiety. In villages and towns, hope bloomed. Farmers organized co-ops. Retired engineers volunteered for local infrastructure planning boards. For the first time in years, people spoke of the future without flinching. But in international boardrooms, alarm bells rang. An editorial in a leading European paper declared, "Burkina Faso turns its back on global order." A trade delegation from Brussels postponed its visit, citing political recalibration. Yet the people stood firm. One radio host in Bobo Dioulasso asked on air, "Is it madness to build your own house with your own hands? Or is it only madness because we've been told we cannot?" Captain Powi, meanwhile, declined interviews and headlines. He crisscrossed the country in an old truck, visiting schools, clinics, and farms. At each stop, he asked citizens what sovereignty meant to them, not as theory, but as practice. A midwife in the town of Zorgo told him, "Sovereignty means I don't have to watch another woman die because we ran out of gauze." A student in Kaya said, "It means I graduate into work, not into waiting." A mechanic in Banfora smiled and answered, "It means my son can fix machines made here, not just carry luggage at airports overseas." Their voices became the true architects of the movement. Outside powers attempted to exert quiet pressure. Behind closed doors, diplomats warned of investment flight. Anonymous threats circulated. But Captain Powi responded not with retaliation but with readiness. "We do not seek conflict," he said in a televised address. "We seek clarity. If this means walking without crutches, we are ready. If this means fewer luxuries today for a stronger spine tomorrow, we accept the price." The international community had seen revolts before, but few had seen one this deliberate, this patient, this people-led. By month's end, 6 neighboring nations had requested copies of Burkina Faso's economic reforms. Regional economists gathered in Niamey to study the model, and in schools across the country, children were asked a new question: what will you build with your freedom? It was no longer just a moment. It was a movement becoming a map. And Captain Powi, refusing to be a messiah, had become something far rarer, a leader who listened. The nation was reclaiming more than sovereignty. It was reclaiming its sense of self. Chapter 6. The Pushback. Every revolution must pass through fire, and Captain Ibraim Powi knew the blaze was coming. 2 weeks after the announcement of the 5 pillars, the first signs of economic retaliation began. International credit agencies whose influence could swing billions issued swift statements. Burkina Faso's rating was downgraded from stable to negative. Watch media headlines across Europe and North America warned of a growing autocracy under the guise of populist reform. Yet, on the streets of Ouagadougou, the atmosphere was far from fearful. In market alleys and university canteens, people discussed budget policy as passionately as football scores. It was as though a veil had lifted, and with it, a new hunger for knowledge. From mobile data packs to village loudspeakers, citizens devoured financial reports, foreign policy briefings, and civic education podcasts. If they were to face consequences for choosing independence, they wanted to understand them fully. But the backlash didn't stop at ratings. A French oil company operating in the southern basin suspended operations, citing uncertainty about contract enforceability. Overnight, hundreds of local workers were furloughed. In the east, a multinational telecom firm slowed its broadband rollout. Western embassies quietly issued travel advisories. And within a month, inflation on some imported goods rose by nearly 12%. Powi did not panic. He convened his cabinet in a dusty conference hall inside a university, not in a marble government building. "We have 2 choices," he told his ministers. "Bend for comfort or stand for change." Our comfort has always come at the cost of submission. We will not bend. What followed was a bold counter-strategy. It didn't involve tanks or threats, but something far more disruptive: community resilience. Local engineers were commissioned to design modular solar grids to reduce dependence on foreign energy firms. Artisans collaborated with university labs to develop cheaper alternatives to imported goods, from basic fertilizers to household items. Regional governors were tasked with creating emergency food reserves in partnership with farming co-ops. And perhaps most unexpectedly, Powi launched a program called the Citizen Table Monthly Open Forum Assemblies in each province, where ordinary citizens could question ministers, propose ideas, and track the progress of reforms. Every session was broadcast live on state radio. While external pressure mounted, Burkina Faso turned inward, not with isolation, but with introspection. Still, the threats escalated. An anonymous leak from a Western intelligence source suggested plans for covert regime change. A shadowy group calling itself the Economic Stabilization Front emerged online, accusing Powi of destroying the investment climate and calling for intervention to restore order. The captain responded not with arrests, but with transparency. He held a press conference, calmly revealing the existence of bribe offers, threats to his family, and clandestine meetings requested by international intermediaries. "You cannot threaten a man who has already buried his fear," he said, "and you cannot bribe a people who have found their voice." The people responded with resolve. A week later, across 37 cities and villages, citizens held candlelight vigils, not in mourning, but as a signal. We are watching. We are awake. International pressure may have scorched the air, but the soil had already taken seed. Artists painted murals of national pride. Musicians composed anthems of resistance. Students distributed leaflets explaining the 5 pillars in 5 major languages and 6 local dialects. Rural women formed mobile cooperatives to trade without foreign intermediaries. In the Sahel, where silence once blanketed political discourse, now came voices, rising like drums before a storm. Meanwhile, across the continent, echoes of Powi's stance grew louder. In Mali and Guinea, debt audits began. Chad formed a parliamentary committee to re-examine its privatization history. A new bloc, the Sovereign Futures Alliance, held its first meeting in Niamey. Though informal, it sent ripples through every office of every development agency with African interests. Back in Burkina Faso, Captain Powi addressed the National Assembly under the newly installed solar lights, lights not powered by foreign contracts, but by the sun, and by a belief that tomorrow could be different. "We are not in a standoff," he said. "We are in a stand-up. We are standing up for our teachers, for our mothers, for our workers, and we do not rise alone." The chamber erupted not just in applause, but in purpose. Outside, under the same stars that once bore witness to centuries of exploitation, a new generation stood waiting. They did not ask if change would come. They asked how much further they could carry it. The pushback had arrived. But so had the push forward. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. 6 months had passed since that stormy afternoon in Riyadh when Captain Ibraim Powi stood before the world and told his truth. What began as a spark had now become a roaring current across the continent. And as tremors of resistance rolled through African capitals, the guardians of the old order could no longer pretend not to notice. The International Monetary Fund, battered by public pressure and facing accusations of neo-colonial policy structures, extended what they called an invitation for dialogue. It was not surrender. It was a chess move. Powi accepted with a condition. The meeting, he said, must be public, not behind closed doors. Let the world watch. And so, for the first time in IMF history, a high-level consultation with an African leader was scheduled to be live-streamed globally. As the day approached, viewership predictions rivaled that of major sporting events. Schools in Burkina Faso declared a half-day to allow students to watch. Towns set up public screens in central squares. From Nairobi to Kingston, Lagos to Berlin, millions waited not for a spectacle, but for a reckoning. The camera lights clicked on. Powi sat at the long, polished conference table, flanked not by lawyers, but by teachers, nurses, and farmers, the real backbone of his nation. Across from him, a panel of IMF officials, economists, and regional coordinators dressed sharply and armed with reports appeared confident. The lead official began. Captain Powi, we acknowledge your concerns. We are committed to inclusive dialogue and sustainable development. But growth must be predictable, and reforms must align with market confidence. Powi nodded slowly, then spoke. Let us not insult each other with euphemisms. Predictability for whom? Confidence for whose markets? For 40 years we followed your prescriptions. We liberalized, we privatized, we restructured, yet we remained poor. Explain that equation. The official shifted. It's not that simple. Development is complex. Powi leaned forward. I agree. So let's not simplify poverty as a result of corruption alone. Let's talk about extraction, about how, for every dollar in aid, $10 in profit leaves Africa. Let's talk about how our public hospitals collapsed while foreign investors enjoyed tax holidays. A silence fell over the room. He continued, calm but unyielding. You come with proposals dressed as lifelines. But lifelines should save, not bind. You say we must cut our public sector to be efficient. Yet when you build embassies, you spare no cost. Why must dignity be a luxury only the rich can afford? One IMF director interjected, attempting diplomacy. We want to support your growth trajectory. Powi looked directly at him. Support does not begin with conditions. It begins with truth. For the next hour, the room swirled in arguments, some data-driven, some deeply emotional. The officials cited balance sheets. Powi responded with case studies. They warned of inflation. He pointed to communities thriving on local trade. When they referenced Burkina Faso's creditworthiness, he reminded them that dignity was not something rated by an agency in New York. At one point, a European observer asked, "Is your end goal economic isolation?" Powi smiled faintly. Number. Our end goal is economic liberation. Isolation is what happens when we are told to participate in a game rigged from the start. Liberation is rewriting the rules. Though no concrete agreement was reached, something more profound occurred. Across the world, viewers saw not an angry radical but a thoughtful leader defending the soul of his people. Hashtags like We Heard Powi and Africa Listens trended. African diaspora communities began organizing forums and fundraisers. Student unions in Europe demanded universities reevaluate partnerships with exploitative firms. In the final moments of the live stream, the lead IMF official extended a hand. Powi stood, took it, and said, "Dialogue is good, but it must lead somewhere. We will not return to the days of polite suffering. We are no longer asking, we are deciding." As the stream ended, cheers erupted from crowds in Ouagadougou. Church bells rang. In a village in Senegal, a griot composed a ballad titled The Man Who Spoke Without Chains. That day, Captain Powi didn't win a negotiation. He won a narrative. He proved that the power of a people united in clarity and courage could challenge even the most entrenched institutions. And while the financial empires would regroup, recalibrate, and retaliate, they now faced a force they could no longer measure in currency. They faced a continent that had begun to believe. The reckoning had not ended. It had only just begun. Chapter 8. The New Beginning. Captain Ibraim Powi returned to Burkina Faso not as a man intoxicated by applause, but as one burdened with purpose. At the Ouagadougou airport, a crowd of thousands greeted him with songs, drums, and ululations. But he raised his hand, gently, motioning for calm. "This is not about me," he said into a megaphone borrowed from a student activist. "This is about us, about a future we must build together." His humility, in contrast to the grandeur of his reception, only deepened the trust people had placed in him. He made no promises of miracles, only work, honesty, and shared responsibility. The government he formed in the weeks that followed was unprecedented in its composition. Teachers, nurses, engineers, farmers, and youth leaders filled key cabinet positions. Not a single foreign-educated technocrat or retired general was among them. He called it a government of the ground. The first order of business was to rewrite the national budget not in isolation, but in public. Powi ordered town hall forums across all provinces. Citizens would vote on spending priorities. The final national budget was published online in multiple local languages, with simple illustrations explaining how funds were allocated. Education received the biggest boost. Classrooms that had been falling apart were repaired. A new teacher training initiative launched with support from retired educators volunteering their time. The curriculum was updated to include African history, critical thinking, and civic ethics subjects that had long been ignored in favor of colonial standards. In the health sector, Powi's government launched a clinic in every commune initiative. Nurses were trained and deployed to remote areas. Traditional healers were also invited to cooperate in community care, bringing ancestral knowledge into respectful dialogue with modern medicine. Meanwhile, Burkina Faso's natural wealth was no longer hidden behind opaque contracts. All mining deals were suspended and reviewed. A national mineral board was established, with members elected by workers' unions and civil society. Companies that refused to renegotiate under fair terms were denied access to resources. Some left. Others, sensing the global mood shift, stayed and accepted the new rules. "We are not anti-business," Powi told an international press conference. "We are pro-dignity. We invite partnership, not plunder." Food sovereignty became a top priority. Government funds went into supporting agricultural cooperatives. Young urban dwellers were encouraged to return to farming, supported with land, tools, and training. School lunch programs were expanded using only local produce. The result: malnutrition rates began to fall within 6 months. International media watched in disbelief. The man once called a populist firebrand was now running one of the most transparent and participatory governments in Africa. A feature in The Guardian called him the most radical pragmatist of our time. But not all was smooth. Border tensions flared with neighboring countries still under foreign-aligned regimes. Trade routes were disrupted. A disinformation campaign spread lies about Powi hoarding power or planning a dictatorship. But each time, his response was the same: openness. He granted regular press access, even to hostile reporters. He refused to shut down opposition media. In fact, he publicly defended a newspaper that published a scathing critique of one of his ministers. "If we silence critics, we silence growth," he said. "Accountability is the air a republic breathes." After 4 years of tireless work, economic growth had returned not explosive, but rooted and real. More importantly, the growth was visible in clean water, filled classrooms, empowered women, and fewer citizens seeking to flee the country. When election season approached, Powi shocked the nation again. He announced he would not seek a second term. "This seat is not a throne," he declared. "It is a tool, and it must not be held too long by one hand." The announcement stunned political analysts. But his supporters, initially dismayed, soon celebrated his integrity. Instead of campaigning for himself, Powi spent the final months of his term mentoring young leaders, ensuring fair elections, and strengthening institutions. On the day of his departure, a crowd gathered once more in the capital. But this time, they came not to cheer a leader, but to walk beside a citizen. Powi exited the presidential compound with no bodyguards, no parade, no medals. A journalist asked what legacy he hoped to leave behind. He smiled. "Let them say we remembered who we were. Let them say we stopped crawling. Let them say we stood." And with that, Captain Ibraim Powi, once a soldier, now a symbol, walked into history not as a ruler, but as a reminder that the greatest power a leader can hold is the courage to let go. Chapter 9. The Awakening Fires. The evening sun cast a golden hue over Ouagadougou's Independence Plaza, where thousands gathered to hear Captain Ibraim Powi speak not as president, but as a citizen. It was his first major public address since stepping down from office. He wore a plain white tunic and walked unescorted to the podium. The quiet murmurs of the crowd fell into silence as he looked across the sea of expectant faces. "This is not the end," he began. "This is only the spark." His words lit a fire, not of anger, but of awakening. Across the continent, his leadership had already inspired a wave of reformists, activists, and everyday citizens to act. The idea that an African leader could serve with integrity and walk away from power voluntarily was no longer myth. It was now memory. And memory, when shared, becomes movement. In Dakar, university students held teach-ins on economic sovereignty. In Lusaka, a group of nurses and midwives launched a cooperative clinic modeled after Powi's rural health initiatives. In rural Kenya, elders convened intergenerational storytelling gatherings, reconnecting youth with ancestral wisdom. Everywhere, the question arose not what will Powi do next, but what will we do now? Youth movements adopted new slogans: dream, organize, transform. The streets once filled with despair now pulsed with purpose. Young people founded citizen councils to audit local spending. Women's groups led food, co-ops, and artisans launched Pan-African marketplaces online, bypassing exploitative intermediaries. Media outlets once cynically dismissive began to report stories of progress slow, hard-earned, but authentic. The African Renaissance, once a hollow phrase in donor reports, began to feel tangible, alive. But with awakening came pushback. In some countries, governments still beholden to foreign interests viewed this new civic energy as dangerous. Protesters were arrested. Media was censored. In one West African nation, a student leader was imprisoned after citing Powi's policies in a televised debate. The news reached Ibraim. He responded not with condemnation, but with strategy. From a modest office in Ouagadougou, he helped launch a new initiative, the People's Assembly, a Pan-African platform that trained grassroots organizers in legal rights, policy literacy, and digital security. It offered free toolkits for community auditing, constitutional education, and peaceful resistance. No funding came from foreign governments, only from small contributions by citizens and African diasporas abroad. The assembly quickly spread to over 22 countries. Its core belief was simple: an informed people is an invincible force. Meanwhile, Ibraim traveled not to red carpets or high-level summits, but to village halls, urban slums, refugee camps, and schoolyards. He listened more than he spoke. In a rural part of southern Niger, a teenage girl asked him, "Captain, why do they fear us so much?" He smiled. "Because you are waking up. And when people wake up, they can no longer be ruled like they are asleep." Poets began to write about the new Africa. Musicians composed ballads and anthems, blending ancient rhythms with lyrics of renewal. Painters created murals of African unity on crumbling city walls. Culture was no longer just heritage, it became resistance, inspiration, and rebirth. The international community watched closely. Some still whispered of instability, others warned of ungovernable populism. But a new class of African diplomats, educated both in tradition and policy, emerged. They were articulate, grounded, and unapologetic about sovereignty. At the African Union, a proposal was submitted to officially recognize the People's Assembly as an observer body. Change was no longer coming. It was here, and it burned like wildfire through the minds of a once silent generation. Back in Burkina Faso, Powi walked alone through a neighborhood he once patrolled as a young officer. Children ran past him, laughing. A mother nodded to him from her doorstep, not in awe, but in recognition. As he sat beneath an old baobab tree, he wrote a single line in his notebook. "Awakening is not a moment, it is a fire that never sleeps." Chapter 10. From Silence to Thunder. The silence that once cloaked the continent had fractured. Where resignation had taken root, now grew resolve. And as the fire of awakening burned steadily across nations, a rumble began quiet at first, like distant drums. But soon, it became thunder. In the back alleys of Lagos and the crowded courtyards of Bamako, people began to speak truths long buried. In Soweto, students organized night schools teaching constitutional rights and the economic history of the continent. In small towns of Tanzania, community radio stations aired open forums on land use, water rights, and ethical governance. Everywhere, the people were taking back the microphone. From silence, they had found their voices. It was in Accra that the first mass mobilization sparked. Youth groups, once divided by tribe or political loyalty, united under one banner, the People's Thunder. They held teach-ins in universities and marketplaces, rejecting political sloganeering and embracing participatory democracy. Street murals bloomed overnight, depicting farmers, teachers, and elders with fists raised, eyes unclouded. Captain Ibraim Powi, though no longer in office, watched the thunder grow from afar. When asked by a journalist whether he would lead these movements, he shook his head. "They do not need me to lead them. They need me to remind them that they are already leaders." Still, his presence remained a catalyst. Videos of his Riyadh speech were now translated into 15 African languages. Snippets became daily affirmations. "We are not beggars, we are builders." Governments across the continent began to respond, some with humility, others with hostility. In Namibia, a new transparency law passed, inspired directly by the People's Assembly toolkits. But in Cameroon, protests were met with tear gas and detentions. Activists went underground, adapting their message into music, theater, and encrypted networks. In Zimbabwe, an unlikely group of grandmothers formed the Sewing Circle for Justice. They stitched protest banners by day and led storytelling circles by night, recounting tales of colonial resistance and lost potential. "We sewed uniforms for colonizers once," one elder said. "Now we stitch a new flag of dignity." International media, at first skeptical, couldn't ignore the storm. CNN called it Africa's second wave of decolonization, not of borders, but of minds and systems. Al Jazeera aired a series titled From Aid to Agency, showcasing the continent's redefinition of power. In Ethiopia, the Prime Minister hosted a People's Forum, the first of its kind, inviting street vendors, teachers, and students to help draft economic policy. In Mozambique, miners demanded transparency in how profits were distributed and won. But thunder, by nature, calls the storm. Old empires, threatened by this grassroots energy, mobilized. Lobbyists pressured their governments to review trade agreements. Media campaigns emerged to portray the uprisings as dangerous, chaotic. Investment firms warned of unpredictability and began withdrawing capital. Still, the people pressed on. In Burkina Faso, a teenage coder named Amadou developed a mobile app, Wazani, meaning balance in Moure, which allowed citizens to track municipal budgets and flag corruption. Within weeks, it was downloaded across 12 countries. One day, while visiting a youth forum in Ghana, Captain Powi addressed the crowd. "You were told to wait for help, for funding, for permission, but thunder waits for no one. It announces the storm, and the storm brings the rain our roots have thirsted for." He paused, scanning the sea of young faces. "Your voices will shake palaces. Your footsteps will redraw roads. You are not the echo of a leader. You are the thunder that breaks silence." The crowd erupted, not in chaos, but in clarity. They knew what came next. Not a protest, not a riot, but a reimagining. From silence to thunder, the continent had spoken. And the world would have no choice but to listen. Chapter 11. The Reckoning. As the thunder of awakening spread across the continent, international powers began to grasp the magnitude of what was unfolding. This was no mere protest movement. It was a recalibration of the African soul, a collective reckoning with the ghosts of exploitation, and a demand for dignity, not charity. The institutions that once dictated policy in faraway conference rooms, IMF boardrooms, G7 roundtables, World Bank symposiums, now found themselves the subject of open debate in village huts and urban cafes alike. The technocratic language of stabilization funds, structural adjustment, and fiscal compliance no longer carried the same mystique. The people had decoded the jargon. They saw the patterns, and they were angry. In the capital city of Burkina Faso, a new headquarters had risen not of glass and steel, but of mud brick and purpose. The Citadel of Sovereignty, as it came to be called, was a gathering hall built by local hands, adorned with murals depicting stories of resistance. Queen Zinga defying Portuguese invaders, Thomas Sankara planting trees, market women resisting taxation under colonial laws. It was here that Captain Ibraim Powi announced the continent's boldest move yet. "We will audit not only our debts, but the contracts that bound us to silence," he declared. "Every clause, every condition, every signature made under duress, let the truth come out." Teams of economists, historians, lawyers, and community elders assembled in each country, poring over decades of deals. They uncovered royalty agreements that paid foreign companies 98% of mining profits. They found land leases that handed over ancestral farms for 99 years in exchange for access to a road that was never built. They discovered aid funds that circled back to donor countries via consulting fees and overpriced equipment. When this evidence was made public, the continent held its breath. Then came the reckoning. In Kenya, civil society leaders sued international agribusiness giants for violating environmental treaties. In Senegal, the national parliament unanimously voted to cancel a port privatization deal that funneled profits to a shell company in Luxembourg. In Zambia, citizens launched a truth commission on financial colonialism, calling it our Nuremberg of debt. Predictably, international backlash followed. Credit rating agencies downgraded multiple African countries. Headlines warned of economic instability and populist mismanagement. Foreign diplomats expressed concern. But on the streets of Yaoundé, Kampala, Addis Ababa, and Monrovia, people did not flinch. "We've lived under economic instability for decades," a teacher in Accra told an interviewer. "What's different now is that we are choosing it ourselves, not being forced into it." The movement even reached the diasporas. African students in Paris and London formed sovereignty chapters, hosting teach-ins, poetry readings, and policy reviews. Caribbean nations sent envoys to learn from the movement. Indigenous leaders in South America and Southeast Asia reached out to express solidarity. At the heart of it all was Captain Powi, but he remained resolute in deflecting hero worship. "This is not my movement," he told the Pan-African Assembly. "It is the return of our stolen breath. I am only a gust. You are the wind." As the audit reports poured in, a growing number of countries issued demands for renegotiation. But more importantly, they made a bold declaration. "We will no longer accept conditions that erase us. We will not fund our development through our erasure." Even some within the IMF began to break ranks. A leaked memo from an internal advisory group revealed that certain officials believed the fund's legacy in Africa had compromised legitimacy beyond repair and urged a rethinking of engagement. When asked if this reckoning would mean isolation, Captain Powi replied, "Number. It means recalibration. We are not leaving the world, we are re-entering it on equal footing. We no longer walk into negotiations begging for crumbs. We come to the table with receipts." In a historic summit held jointly by the African Union and the Caribbean Community, CARICOM, leaders signed the Declaration of Economic Memory and Future Dignity. The declaration recognized the shared trauma of debt manipulation, resource exploitation, and external governance. It committed to creating a continental framework for ethical foreign partnerships, guided not by desperation, but by vision. The world was watching, and for the first time in a long time, Africa was not reacting, it was leading. And the reckoning, once feared, had become a cleansing, not of vengeance, but of veils. A continent was looking in the mirror and finally seeing itself, not through the eyes of colonizers, economists, or investors, but through the eyes of its own people. The silence was broken. The thunder had roared. And now came the rain, the cleansing, renewing rain of truth. Chapter 12. The New Covenant. The dust of reckoning had not yet settled when a new chapter began to rise. In the aftermath of the audits and public disclosures, citizens across the continent demanded not just accountability from the past, but a vision for the future. What would replace the old contracts? The foreign-led development models? The exploitative partnerships? The answer came in the form of a bold initiative unveiled at the Citadel of Sovereignty, the New Covenant for African Renewal. Crafted not in secrecy, but through months of public consultations, listening forums, and regional assemblies, the New Covenant was a manifesto for governance with integrity. It did not come from technocrats or lobbyists. It came from farmers, teachers, students, historians, healers, and builders. Each clause reflected lived experience. Each word was chosen to restore not just economies, but the spirit. Captain Ibraim Powi stood before the world once more, not as a single voice, but as a channel for millions. "We have written our contract with ourselves," he said. "This time, the signatures are not forged by fear. They are etched in dignity." The New Covenant was built on 5 founding pillars. Sovereign ownership of resources. No resource could be extracted without community consent. Fair profit, sharing, and environmental stewardship. All future contracts would be public by default. Ethical partnership standards. Any foreign or local business operating in African territories would be evaluated not only on profit, but on contribution to local value chains, labor rights, and environmental responsibility. People-centered budgets. National budgets would prioritize basic needs, education, health, housing, before debt servicing. Community oversight boards would have veto power over budget allocations. Historical restoration. A continental archive would be created to record and seek reparations for historical injustices, colonial theft, unfair treaties, land dispossession. A special tribunal for financial exploitation was proposed. Democratic vigilance. Every government signatory to the New Covenant had to pass a law protecting whistleblowers, guaranteeing freedom of information, and mandating annual national town halls where leaders directly answered to the people. These were not empty slogans. They were battle-tested demands rising from decades of silence and suffering. To the surprise of many, several governments rushed to adopt the covenant's tenets. Ghana passed a law requiring that all natural resource contracts be co-signed by a citizen-elected board. In Ethiopia, public audits were live-streamed for the first time. Even in fragile states, youth-led movements began drafting their own localized versions of the covenant. But it wasn't just politics that changed. Culture itself began to shift. Across cities and towns, murals sprang up portraying African philosophers, scientists, and engineers instead of foreign leaders. Schools began replacing colonial curricula with homegrown history, African ethics, and entrepreneurship. Pop music, once dominated by escapist themes, now buzzed with lyrics about dignity, sovereignty, and pride. The real revolution, Powi said in a national address, is not what we remove, it is what we reclaim. Of course, challenges remained. Some entrenched elites resisted the new order, fearing loss of privilege. A few former allies of the movement tried to exploit it for personal gain. And there were whispers of sabotage from foreign companies whose contracts were under review. Yet, unlike in the past, these threats were met with organized, informed, and peaceful resistance. Community radio stations, now operating under citizen licenses, broadcast updates about government performance and resource allocations. An app developed by students in Lagos allowed any user to flag suspicious projects or contracts. And in a first for the continent, a network of public defenders was established to protect those who stood up against corruption. The covenant became more than a policy, it became a culture. In weddings, people toasted not just love, but legacy. In funerals, they honored not just the life lost, but the future protected. The phrase, "as per the covenant," began to appear in everyday conversation, from marketplace negotiations to university debates. And while foreign media initially mocked it as a utopian experiment, they soon had to recalibrate. Reports from independent observers confirmed rising literacy rates, drops in youth migration, increases in local investment, and the first signs of regional economic convergence without external debt dependence. It wasn't perfection, but it was progress. And most importantly, it was owned by the people. Captain Powi, in one of his quiet moments, reflected on the journey with a group of elders beneath a baobab tree in his hometown. When we were young, an old man said, "We were told that freedom was impossible, that the system was too strong. And yet," Powi replied, "here we are. Not because we waited for permission, but because we remembered who we were." The new covenant was not a destination. It was a compass. And across Africa, millions were learning to read it not with fear, but with resolve. The silence of the past had given way to thunder, and now the thunder had given way to purpose. The future had found its map. Chapter 13. The Spirit of Ancestors. In the stillness of dawn, when the city had not yet stirred, and only the birds whispered between mango trees, Captain Ibraim Powi often walked barefoot through the ancestral garden behind the presidential compound. This was no political ritual. It was communion. Among the medicinal shrubs and ancestral stones, he would reflect not on policies, but on memory, the living kind passed down not in books, but in breath. Here, he remembered his grandmother's hands grinding millet, the chants sung during planting season, and the wisdoms buried with the bones of the elders. Africa was not awakening to something new. It was returning to something ancient. The spirit of the ancestors, the 13th principle of the movement, was not just symbolic. It was foundational. Under this pillar, citizens were encouraged to reconnect with indigenous systems of governance, justice, health, and education that had been dismissed or demonized during centuries of colonization. Before the empire, Powi said in one gathering, "We knew how to govern. We knew how to heal. We knew how to live in balance. The ancestors are not dead. They are waiting for us to listen." This shift began subtly. In rural communities, councils of elders were once again called upon to resolve land disputes using oral history, communal testimony, and consensus building instead of adversarial legal codes imported from Europe. In coastal villages, traditional fishery rights, long violated by foreign trawlers, were restored through maritime pacts rooted in clan memory and seasonal wisdom. Education, too, underwent a cultural renaissance. New primary school readers included proverbs from Akan, Fulani, Zulu, and Berber traditions. Classrooms adopted storytelling as a teaching method, blending algebra with indigenous measurements, science with agricultural knowledge, and ethics with ancestral tales. Students studied both ancient civilizations and modern struggles. They were taught to see their lineage not as broken, but as powerful. Festivals once repressed were revived in full color. In Mali, the Jeli, griot, families were publicly honored for preserving oral history. In Tanzania, elders were invited to teach conflict resolution in police academies. Across Sahelian nations, women-led healing circles, once deemed unscientific, gained recognition for their role in community trauma recovery. Spirituality, too, found new space not in opposition to modern religion, but in harmony with it. Temples, churches, and mosques all began setting aside days to reflect on shared ancestry and African stewardship. Young preachers quoted not just scripture, but Sankofa, the symbol of returning to retrieve what was forgotten. "There is no contradiction," said Mama Geneva, a spiritual leader from Burkina's south. "We are not choosing the past over the future. We are using the past to build a future that fits us." For many, this reclamation brought healing. For centuries, African identity had been shattered, defined from the outside, distorted by conquest, reduced to suffering. Now, communities were reassembling the mosaic, one tradition at a time. International observers began to take note. UNESCO recognized several revived knowledge systems as intangible heritage of global value. Medical journals published findings on the efficacy of indigenous herbal treatments when paired with modern methods. Scholars who had once dismissed oral tradition as folklore now sought to understand its epistemological depth. Yet the spirit of ancestors was not without its tensions. Some elites scoffed at what they called nostalgic populism. Foreign consultants questioned whether indigenous practices could scale to national policy. Even some urban youth, raised on digital culture, initially viewed the revival as irrelevant. But slowly, their perspectives began to shift, especially when they saw how tradition and technology could coexist. Youth in Kampala launched a podcast that translated ancestral wisdom into modern civic lessons. A design school in Accra used Ashanti weaving techniques in building eco-homes, and an app called RootMap allowed users to trace clan histories across borders, fostering Pan-African kinship. Captain Powi understood this delicate balance. In a fireside dialogue aired across the continent, he explained, "We are not returning to live as our ancestors did. We are returning to learn how they endured, how they organized, how they cared. They survived captivity, drought, colonization, and yet they never forgot who they were. That memory is our inheritance." In his final act for the Spirit of Ancestors program, Powi commissioned a Continental Archive, a network of oral historians, archivists, and linguists tasked with preserving local languages, land rituals, conflict resolutions, and spiritual practices. It was called the Library of the Living. Unlike stone libraries, it was mobile, multilingual, and community-driven. It did not merely collect knowledge, it returned it. Every elder interviewed trained an apprentice. Every story recorded was shared back. Every tradition validated became a seed for the next generation. And so, as Africa rose from centuries of division and exploitation, it did so not by rejecting its roots, but by deepening them. Not by abandoning memory, but by reweaving it into the fabric of public life. The Spirit of Ancestors was not a backward glance. It was a compass pointing home. And across the continent, millions were learning, once more, to walk with their heads high, their hearts full, and their feet rooted in sacred soil. The reckoning had lit the fire. Now, the ancestors were feeding it with wisdom. And the world, once deaf to the whispers of Africa's past, now leaned in to listen. Chapter 14. The Unstoppable Rise. By now, the movement was unstoppable. What had begun as a defiant speech by one man had ignited something elemental across an entire continent. From dusty villages to gleaming high-rises, across cities buzzing with new energy and rural fields tilled with fresh hope, Africa was waking up not to chaos, but to purpose. The old barriers drawn in ink by colonial hands began to blur. Trade posts at former borders turned into hubs of exchange and celebration. Flags still waved, but now with shared pride, not in conquest or domination, but in survival, resistance, and rebirth. In Niger, youth groups formed independent media cooperatives to investigate corruption. In Kenya, farmers launched collectives that exported directly to fellow African countries, bypassing European middlemen. In South Africa, township schools implemented Pan-African history programs taught by elders who once marched with revolutionaries. And in Senegal, musicians turned town squares into classrooms, rhyming about currency traps and food sovereignty. Captain Ibraim Powi watched this wave, not as a ruler, but as a witness. He often said, "If a leader is necessary for change to begin, let him be forgotten once the people remember their own power." No longer was the message, "Follow me." The message now was, "Follow each other, trust each other, rise together." Even in countries where regimes tried to suppress the movement, the energy could not be contained. The youth, armed with smartphones and solidarity, found ways to organize. They shared manuals on cooperatives, translated economic charters into local dialects, and created Pan-African study circles in universities. An entire generation, long dismissed as aimless or angry, had found its compass. International powers noticed. The World Bank hosted emergency seminars on the African question. Embassies sent reports home warning of ideological contagion. Financial analysts debated the implications of new intra-African trade routes that bypassed global giants. They feared instability, but what they feared more was irrelevance. As foreign firms lost monopoly privileges, some pulled out, but the vacuum didn't last long. Local entrepreneurs stepped in women's collectives, started local textile factories. Ex-engineers from the diaspora returned to build solar plants. Youth with tech skills created mobile banking systems tailored to rural economies. What had once been seen as weakness, lack of foreign dependence, was now Africa's greatest strength. Ibraim Powi was invited to dozens of international forums, but he declined most. "Let the world come to Africa to listen," he said. "We are done explaining ourselves in rooms that never belonged to us." Instead, he focused on strengthening the Sovereign Futures Alliance. It was no longer just a bloc, it was a blueprint. Member states agreed to rotate summits across capitals, ensuring every country, no matter how small, had a voice. Economic plans were drafted transparently with citizen feedback. A digital platform allowed farmers in Ghana to collaborate with those in Cameroon, teachers in Uganda to share resources with peers in Togo, and nurses in Rwanda to report shortages directly to regional suppliers. The phrase "Made in Africa" began to mean something new, not just origin, but ownership. Cultural festivals revived indigenous languages and dances once shamed or banned. African filmmakers produced stories not of suffering, but of strength. Poets were invited to parliaments to speak before new legislation passed. And through it all, the people kept saying, "We are not just surviving, we are living, and we are rising." As for Captain Powi, he remained grounded. He refused statues, refused titles. When one interviewer asked what title he preferred, he answered, "Son of the soil." When another asked what his legacy would be, he said simply, "If my people feel taller now, then that is enough." The master had not fallen because he was pushed. The master had fallen because the servant had stood up. And in that rising, the world shifted. Chapter 15. The Dawn of a New Africa. As the first rays of sunlight spilled over the Sahel, bathing the red soil in gold, a new Africa stirred. It was not the rebirth promised by foreign consultants in air-conditioned hotel lobbies. It was the quiet, profound awakening of a people who had reclaimed their voice. In the heart of Ouagadougou, schoolchildren recited new pledges in classrooms, painted with murals of African heroes, Sankara, Biko, Funmilayo, Ransom Kuti, and now, Ibraim Powi. But Powi himself had warned, "Do not paint me larger than life. Paint the people who rose with me." Across the continent, the rhythm of life had changed. Markets hummed not just with commerce, but with pride. Farmers gathered under baobab trees to plan harvests, no longer dictated by foreign quotas, but by local need and regional demand. Solar panels glittered on village roofs, powering lights in homes that had known only darkness for generations. Education had become a sacred pillar. Curriculums now taught African philosophy alongside mathematics, ethics with economics, and languages once banned by colonizers were spoken proudly in schools and parliaments. In universities, students debated policy in open forums, often joined by ministers who listened, not lectured. Healthcare, too, transformed. The Sovereign Futures Alliance had pooled resources to create an Africa-based pharmaceutical trust, no longer reliant on leftover medicine or second-hand technology. The continent was investing in its own biomedical research vaccines developed in Accra, surgical equipment manufactured in Addis Ababa, and herbal medicine studied with scientific rigor in Banjul. The arts flourished. From Johannesburg to Dakar, a new wave of creators redefined African identity through film, fashion, sculpture, and song. Drummers played rhythms once considered rebellious, now revered. Women wove textiles that told stories of resistance and rebirth. Dancers moved with a freedom that transcended choreography. It was spirit. But perhaps the most striking transformation was political. Gone were the tired slogans and top-down decrees. In their place stood participatory governance, community forums, digital referendums, rotating leadership councils. Leaders were now judged not by their proximity to global powers, but by their proximity to the truth. Those who failed their people were recalled. Those who served them were supported. In this landscape, Captain Ibraim Powi remained a presence but not a ruler. He had stepped down. True to his word, he declined requests to run for a second term, stating, "I did not come to stay in power. I came to return it to you." He spent his post-leadership days quietly, tending to a modest farm in the north where he had once played as a child. There, he welcomed students, thinkers, and dreamers. He listened more than he spoke, and when asked for advice, he would often quote the wisdom of his grandmother. A leader is not the loudest voice, but the one who walks behind to lift those who fall. One evening, in a special broadcast streamed across the continent, a journalist asked Powi what he hoped future generations would remember. He responded, "Let them not remember my name, but what we dared to do. Let them remember the day we stopped begging for a seat at someone else's table and built our own. Let them remember the gardens we planted, the knowledge we unearthed, and the songs we sang in our own languages. Let them remember that we rose not in anger, but in clarity. And above all, let them remember that Africa never needed permission to be great, only the will to believe it." As the sun set behind him, casting long shadows over the red earth, his words carried far and wide not as echoes of a past revolution, but as a living seed. The dawn of a new Africa had come. And this time, the world was watching not as saviors, not as skeptics, but as witnesses to a rising too bright to ignore.